Using gallery view. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning.
I am really excited to have you here today because we're going to talk about story and story as data compression and story as pattern recognition. And part of the reason we decided to tackle this is that in our last episode, we were discussing Stephen Wolfram's theory of everything. And in that episode, we discussed his idea that there is, in all of this computational irreducibility that is our universe, there is a layer of computational reducibility. And at the end of our last talk, you and I sort of posited that that layer of computational reducibility might in essence be what we think of as story, because story is what we live within. So with that as an introduction, I wanted to just touch on a couple of things to kind of give us a thread to move forward on. The other thing we were talking about in our last discussion was this idea that authors, good authors, show in their stories that they care about their characters, and they, in some way, they must sacrifice something for their characters to explore their potential. So I thought that would be a very interesting thread to continue, because I've been thinking a lot about just the fundamental nature of story and the fundamental nature of character development. And so I started reading that book you recommended of Barfield, Saving the Appearances. And as usual, I didn't get very far because I go very slowly through these things.
It's a tough book.
Yeah, but
especially the beginning.
So he uses some terminology that he purposely chose some words that aren't used in other ways so that he could differentiate his ideas. And he talks about pattern recognition. Well, okay. So because the world is composed of particles and not things, I mean, at one level it's composed of particles and not things. As human beings and as observers and as what he calls percipients, people who perceive, we are looking out at this field of infinite potential, and we are choosing out of that field some sort of a pattern that appears to us as something, and he calls that process figuration. So there is something that makes things come into focus for us, and I think that's a really big idea. It's got a lot of things wrapped up into it, the whole idea of things having boundaries and things having space.
And it's important to point out a large percentage of figuration is unconscious, right? Yes. It's processes beneath our conscious layer, but there is this kind of interaction as well with the conscious layer that when it becomes instantiated for long enough time periods, it kind of works its way back down into that unconscious layer again.
Yes, and then he also talked about alpha thinking and beta thinking. Alpha thinking is when we actually think about the thing, right? And beta thinking is when we think about the thing in relation to other things. If I recall, that's
well more precise, at least from my perspective, what I recall, because again, it's especially the beginning of that book is really difficult because he, as you mentioned, he's trying to set the terms for the book and he's trying to use language in kind of novel ways. But alpha thinking is that it is that thinking about figuration kind of, or it's well, not thinking about the processes whereby it is, but it's a reflection on the results of figuration. You know, what the representations that figuration produces in the mind, the models of the world, it's thinking about those things. That's alpha thinking. It's kind of like order one. And then beta thinking is kind of this more self-reflective thinking about thinking. So it's like trying to kind of look at the lens that you're using to see the world with and looking at it to understand how it's working. That's beta thinking.
Okay, so I was thinking about stories in relation to, well, a lot of things came into my mind, okay? Many things. The discussions we've had about scientism, the discussions we've had about ideologies, and the discussion that we've had about stories. And I think all of those things are connected somehow, because in the notes that I wrote on something, yeah, I don't know if you gave me this quote or somebody else gave me this quote, but there's a quote from Oswald Chambers. People pour themselves into their own doctrines, and God has to blast them out of their preconceived ideas before they can become devoted to Jesus Christ. And in thinking about that quote, I thought, I think when he uses the word doctrine, really, it would be better to use the word ideology, because doctrine can have, there can be some positive connotations on doctrine, but ideology, I think, is mainly a pejorative. So let's say instead of doctrine, it's ideology. People pour themselves into their own ideologies, and God has to blast them out of their preconceived ideas before they can become devoted to Jesus Christ. So I wrote...
Or a more generic term might just be map, their map. I mean, it's, in terms of Peterson's perspective, the map is neither good nor bad. It's just, it is the thing that we have to make so that we have some framing of the world, so that it doesn't overwhelm us with its chaos.
Right, but that's more of that's a necessity of personal experience, having a map. But an ideology is when you get trapped inside an incomplete picture.
I think an ideology is a map that has, as Peterson would say again, it's like a poorly formed religion. It has religious claims because it's claiming to be a map that can incorporate all the other maps into it. Like it's like a master map of some kind, but it fails to do that effectively.
Right. Yeah. It's in one way or another, it's armless or legless, or it's missing essential pieces that make it very constricting.
Yeah. In the modern frame, it tends to be very unidimensional. Like whether it's, Marx and the class is the one thing we use to understand everything, or with, modern critical theory, where it's some sort of element of identity, whether it's, race or gender or whatever, that these variable elements purport to tell the story of everything.
So I started thinking about that so one of the things I was thinking about is the discussions we've had in the past about scientism as opposed to science. That scientism is kind of like an ideology of sorts. It's an incomplete religion. And it becomes a silo, like Oswald Chambers was talking about. It becomes this silo where you're just inside this thing. And the rationalist pours himself and all his scientific beliefs into that silo of preconceived ideas. One idea gets built up on the next, and you get this incremental progress, always moving in one direction. But then along comes someone like an Einstein, who, for whatever reason, he is able to, or he is, by some outside bit of knowledge that he gains, he's able to be blasted out of these preconceived ideas of the past, and he becomes devoted to a new idea, something that's new and outside of the silo, that creates a new lens on how the universe works. So he's able to see through a unique lens rather than the lens that is trying to be forced on everybody, forcing everybody to see through the same lens. And I see that sometimes in authors who are writing a story, that the author has an agenda, and because he has an agenda, he wants everybody to see through the same lens that he sees, and he makes all his characters see through the same lens, and he's trying to push all of the viewers of the story to see through that same lens.
Yeah, I mean that's what I think a poor storyteller does, because again, what he's failing to do in that scenario is he's failing, as we pointed out earlier, to actually lay down his life for his characters, so that the characters have an existence of their own, a perspective of their own, a complexity of their own to wrestle with and interact with the ideas. So he has, the characters are pawns really that exist for some other purpose. They're kind of, they're puppets, and we all recognize that. I think this is something we all instinctively recognize, that greater works of art, in the realm of story, always they are able to cross some line where the character seemingly comes alive. It seems to be more than just a character, and those are the sorts of characters you carry around with you for the rest of your life, because they actually, there's something about them that is, and I don't know what it is per se, because even rather simple stories can convey this. It doesn't, but there's something of, I don't know, something that I think the author contributes in terms of laying down their life for the character, where that character takes up some real residence in their head, and they're able to birth it into reality in such a way that the people that interact with it later, um, also have a similar experience.
Yeah, I part of what I think is happening is that the author, well, I've read about authors who say that they develop a character, they imagine a character, they give the character some background in their mind, and then they let the characters begin to write the story. The characters have their own
Hmm.
will and purpose, and the story comes out of the characters. The story doesn't, it isn't like the author has a story in mind. Oh, I want to make this story. So how am I going to people this story? What kind of
Yeah.
people will be in it? He imagines people, and then he puts the people in an environment, and then then the story writes itself, sort of. Of course, the author must have some sort of narrative arc in mind, or some, they must have some plot points in mind that they're going to insert in there. But um, the thing I notice a lot when I told you we're watching through all the episodes of Monk, so we're like in season 5 now. And the thing I notice about every episode is there will be some random thing that happens completely aside from the main story. And
Hmm.
you just think, every single time I get fooled into thinking, this is just a random side story that they're throwing in there for a little extra interest or a little extra, you know, um, distraction or something. But every time that thing is the thing, that thing is the thing that eventually makes the whole pattern fall into place. So it's these little random events are the thing that focus your
Yeah.
sight at the end so that you can see how all the pieces fit together. And that's that's quite a talent, you know.
Yeah, I think it was Chekhov, the Russian writer, who said something like, if a gun appears in the first act, it better be fired by the second act. You know, um, and it's something about effective storytelling again, and this gets back into what I was saying before we started recording, which is there's this overlap between meaning and data compression. And so effective storytelling, in an effective storytelling model, no detail of the story is superfluous, right? It's all there by design, and it's all working towards some end. And I think that's what, it, and within our frame, any sort of story that purports to that level of detail, of being able to incorporate all the details into a single unifying story, it's a religion. There's, that by definition it is, whether it's an ideology, as we mentioned, it's that's masquerading as religion. If it purports to unify everything together, then it's a religion.
Okay, follow, keep going. I'm listening.
And so
But what,
I
when you
think,
say religion, what do you mean? Maybe I should, because I probably use religion differently than you do. So
okay, I mean, it's kind of a tautology, but like, just I say a religion is that whatever has claims on being of highest value, or giving the ability to, like I said, unify and provide a lens on everything. That's a religion by definition, no matter what it is. And I think it's more basically, though, it's something that exists in everybody, right? This is the hierarchy that Jordan Peterson refers to, that enables action at all in biological creatures, because without this being instantiated you at a physical level of your being, you could not act in the world, because action always boils down to a binary of yes or no. And to get that level of specificity, you need something like a hierarchy that says this is more important than this, which is more important than this, which is more important than this. And as you go, and it's got to be able to do this in real time so that you can decide, yes, I will do X rather than Y, or I will, act rather than sit still, or I will go from point A to point B because point B is better on some level of this hierarchy. So I think, I think, again, the religious element of it is the unifying aspect of, because again, we have all these different stories, we have all these different maps, we have all these different elements of data compression, that are instantiated in us, and the religious layer is this higher abstract layer of storytelling that incorporates them all together. I mean, the interesting thing about stories is how well they nest inside one another, right? So whatever story you're in, it's nested inside another story, like, if I asked you to tell me about your day yesterday, you're going to tell me a story, that just whatever pops out of what's meaningful that happened yesterday. You're not going to tell me that you read 37 emails, or that you consumed X amount of calories, or that you walked so many steps. You're going to tell me something's going to, like, spontaneously come out of your consciousness of what was meaningful that happened to you yesterday. But that story then is nestled inside this other story, which is your life, right? And all these get nested inside each other up until the highest level of story that you could imagine, which is in scope way beyond you, and that's your religion, right? And it encompasses you and your family and your community and your country and the whole world and eternity, right? So there's this structural component that, because we're finite creatures, always involves this massive amount of data compression so that it can fit inside of our our very limited capacities to remember, to communicate, etc.
so that kind of makes me think about an idea that I was trying to process this morning about the order in which things are important in a work of art. Well, not necessarily importance, but maybe the order of perception in a work of art, or the order of choice, design. These things are hard to pin down. But the first thing has to be the boundary, which is the size of the substrate. If I'm working on a
Mhm.
canvas or a piece of paper or whatever, there's an outside edge to it. That's as far as I can go when I'm creating the story on the canvas. The edge is as far as I can go. So that's the boundary. Then within that boundary, you have to make a decision. Are you going to have what's called a closed composition or an open composition? A closed composition are the kind of paintings that you see where maybe there's a house and some trees in the middle and a deer or something, or you see some figures in the middle of a field, or the whole picture is there on the inside of the frame. An
Mhm.
open composition is one in which elements of the picture exceed the size of the boundary. And so
How is
you
it
see,
that they exceed it? Is it just because they're implied to extend?
well, you've seen, let's say you've seen figural paintings where there's a person, but you're only seeing maybe the top of their head touches the top, goes a little bit beyond the frame, and their arms go beyond the frame and their legs go beyond the frame. So all you're seeing is their trunk. So your imagination makes up the rest of the figure.
Right, right.
It might be flowers that, you might see a field of flowers and some of the field of flowers goes beyond. So there's something on the outside of the frame. That's called an open composition, because it leaves something open for the viewer to use their imagination to fill it out. So that's a decision that you have to make before you start. If you're going to paint something rather than just a non-objective field of color, you have to make some sort of decision about closed or open composition. And then the third thing is there's what's called an order of seeing, because when you look at the world, there's value, dark and light, and there's
Mhm.
also color, and there's also pattern, there's also shape. But the first thing that a person sees when they look at a piece of art, the first thing they notice is the value difference. So if you
The
want
contrast.
something that catches people's eyes, you want to make a strong value differential in the
Yeah.
painting.
It's funny. I've heard the same thing too with audio as well. Like one of the ways you distinguish whether something meaningful is being said is the dynamic range between the highest and lowest. That tells you something more interesting is going on, and that's like in classical music, for instance. There tends to be a much higher dynamic range than a lot of modern digital devices even support. Um, like how soft it gets to how loud, the highs and the low notes and all those are much greater in those pieces.
Yep, and that'll tend to point you also towards the focal point, the place the artist wants you to look will generally be the place of the lightest lights and the darkest darks, the
Hmm.
most contrast. That place is where the artist wants you to look. And then there are a whole lot of other things in the elements and principles of art that you have to consider, but floating through all of those other things is this idea of dominance. So within your color choices, you have to have dominance of one color choice over the other colors. You have to have dominance of one type of pattern over the other ones. And it has to be dominant in the sense that it's like 80% of the painting is this thing, and the other
Hmm.
20% is all the other things. And the reason that that is so is that without the dominance, there's no stability. There's no unity.
Hmm.
The dominance produces the unity.
Right, and the unity is what tells you there's purpose.
Yes. Yes.
And I think this is where this kind of gets back to Barfield in terms of beauty, and where beauty is, it's the whole apprehended all at once. So it's all those elements you were talking about in terms of the design, but they're all they come together at once. And you can be looking at, say, like a painting, and you're kind of like, as you said, you're going through your order of operations, and you're kind of it's coming together, and then there can be a point where like it suddenly you get it, right? Like where the beauty kind of hits you, and maybe even it hits you and it doesn't hit the other two or three other people who are sitting next to you, right? So this is something Vervaeke talked about in his one of his lectures where he goes into Barfield, specifically Barfield and Paul Tillich. He talks about the transjective, which is this combination between the objective and the subjective, which is what kind of comes together in that moment of beauty, where you are apprehending what you're seeing, but in another sense, you feel apprehended as well. Like you've been pulled up to some other layer of viewing reality by your interaction with this thing, and what you're, in some sense, what you're apprehending at that, or being pulled up to see at that higher level, is a sense of the connectedness of things, right, and their purpose.
Wow. I haven't listened to that much of Vervaeke, but I really love that picture.
Yeah, well, that was me blending together Vervaeke, which is he's very kind of matter of fact and very granular. He gets so precise with the details, and he gets very upset with people that are missing some detail. And then there's this DC Schindler. I think I may have shared with you. He has a specific talk where he talks about beauty in the work of von Balthasar. But
Yeah, I want to go back and listen to that again, because
yeah,
I think that's a really important element right there. Because that the artist is not always conscious. Well, there's two things. The artist is not always conscious of what has shown up in the work that other people can see. But it's sort of like, let's imagine you're cooking a meal. You're cooking a fine cuisine or something, and you have the recipe and you have all the things that you have to follow. A lot of people say that once they get done cooking a fine cuisine meal and they sit down to eat, they can't even really enjoy it, because like all the enjoyment got worked out in the process. Where the other people are eating it and they're finding it so delicious because they didn't get bogged down in all the tedium of the process. Yeah. So some people, when they do art appreciation classes, they learn about all these things. So when they go look at a work of art, they're looking for the value distinction and the composition, and it kind of takes the stuffing out of it. I mean, you can appreciate it. You can appreciate the artist's process. You can appreciate the effort that went into it and all that, but you don't get that transcendent sense of oomph that hits you when all the pieces line up for you, that just meets you in that pre-cognitive place, right?
Oh, that's very interesting. It reminds me of one of my favorite books is this book called The Chosen, which I've read many times. I think I've talked to you about it before. I'm sorry?
By Chaim Potok?
Have you read it?
Years ago, yeah.
I think we've talked about it.
20, yeah.
So anyway, I read it when I was younger as well, and I keep coming back to it. And the first time I read it was for actually in college for like it was like on a list of books you could do a paper on. And I still remember the paper I wrote on that book was probably one of the worst papers I've written. And I usually was pretty good at writing stuff. I usually did pretty well with that. And I would usually get engrossed in my writing process enough that I could really imaginatively go somewhere with it. But specifically, I remember, and I liked that book so much that I couldn't deconstruct it. Like I didn't want to. Like I didn't want to do what you were saying. Like I didn't want to pull apart the elements of style and things in that. I didn't want to look behind, the magic show to see how the tricks were done. I just didn't want to, I guess, or maybe I wasn't able to, or maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure, but I remember that I just that paper was so awful because I just couldn't do it, you know.
So what was it about that book that really spoke to you?
I think it's for me, I think it was about the ways in which pain and suffering are this necessary fabric in the world, and it was just kind of an intimation of why that might not be the horrible thing that we think it is, you know. um that there's something we're given access to in pain and suffering that is greatly outweighs the cost we endure in taking it on. um and that's something I pulled away from it anyway. um and it's something like, even, you know, when I've been away from faith and had a very difficult time seeing purpose and meaning in the world, my engagement with that book would just throw a wrench in any sort of my kind of materialist leanings, right? There's just like an undeniable sense of purpose and meaning that just screamed at me through the book. And it's not a Christian book. It's like it's written by a you know, a guy that was raised as an Orthodox Jew, and he was a rabbi and philosophy and literature professor, and very interesting guy. You know, I've subsequently you know, read interviews with him that made me think, I don't even think he meant to put into that work what I got out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was still there, right? Because he 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 did his best to lay something down in there that was real, you know, that came out of the imagination, that and it just was very effective. um but you know, it makes me think, you know, so many people are leaving faith right now in the current time frame, and there's this sense in that what is causing them to do it is like, oh well, they just, because of science, they can't believe in God. I don't think that's necessarily it. I think if you look at most people, I don't know if you saw that Nathan Jacobs film, Becoming Human. He's a guy that was he's a
Interviewed
professor,
all
but
the nuns.
I'm sorry.
He's the guy that interviewed all the nuns.
Yeah, did you see that film?
I saw little bits of it, and then I also saw Paul's interview with him.
Yeah, but if you look at that, you almost uniformly, the case is that it's the problem of evil that leads people away.
Mhm.
And so it's always, there's a story about like these, I saw these bad things happen. I just don't understand how that could be possible for God. Like it was just over and over and over. Like, and and in people I've talked to anecdotally, that seems to be the case for them as well. And it was for me, you know. And so and it's not so much that science is so compelling, but it does have this explanation for, okay, why is there evil and suffering in the world? Well, because this is all just a big accident. And um none of it really means anything, so you can't be surprised that a lot of it, you know, goes off the rails, or that, you know, um there's pain and suffering, because there is no purpose. That's the answer, right? It's the and that I think is what people find persuasive, you know. It's like, oh, okay, I've been looking for this purpose and everything, but there is no purpose. Okay, that makes sense. It's kind of a, I don't know. It obviously introduces really big philosophical problems into your structure of knowledge and what you know and everything, that I don't think most people take very seriously. They don't realize what they're buying into when they accept that. But
Would you like to expand on those problems that arise? This
Well,
is
I'll just
this is a subject of great interest to me.
yeah. Well, we were talking a little bit about that series, like Stories of Old, right? That
Yeah.
he's going through, and he makes this very compelling argument, that this stark difference between our stories, where you have the hero and they go on the hero's journey, and he comes back transformed and renewed, and uh, he learns something, and he wins the day. He brings back the gold from the unknown and enriches his community. He's transformed, and he's now the master of both the unknown and the known. He's gone through this transformation, and he makes the point that this isn't really true, and that we, you know, these he almost makes the case that it's kind of a lie, right? That these stories, because the stories often purport that the hero is somebody ordinary, and then you come to find out he goes on this extraordinary adventure. But then he makes the point that, well, actually, they were always meant to be this, because he's basically saying the author tricks you, right? And they were always destined to go on this journey, whereas we're not, because and he doesn't really explain why we're not, right? It's just assumed, right? We all know that this is all big accident. There is no larger purpose. So he goes through basically 2 videos worth of this, where he fully embraces the scientific perspective of, these stories offer meaning, but we know it's a false meaning, because there's no author writing this story. We know that, right? And then he gets to the end, and basically says, in the last few moments, and I remember reading the comments on YouTube, there's so many people typing oh, this was so meaningful, and I teared up, and I couldn't stop crying watching the final minutes of this video. And it is very emotionally stirring. He takes this, kind of heightens the music, and there's all these clips from the finale points of all these different films that are in a montage together. But his highlight, or his twist, is that we can become our own storyteller. That even though there is no meaning in the universe, I can decide for myself, I'm going to cram this life with all the meaning and beauty that I desire. But the problem that gets right back to the problem of what we were just talking about is beauty isn't beauty disconnected from the whole. If the beauty and meaning only exists in my skull, it's very cramped conditions for what I want. Meaning on the scale of the individual isn't really meaning at all. What we all hunger and desire for is that my story has an impact on the larger story. And that, in some sense, that's what makes it the hero's journey, is that my little story somehow has this larger impact, that it's nestled inside in a fitting way to the larger story. And so when we take the bait of what he says, oh, I can make my own story, I've swallowed hook, line, and sinker that whole framework that there is no meaning outside of between my ears. And so sure, I get this moment of defiance where I'm screw you, cold universe, I'm going to make my own meaning. But then we're left with a meaning that we know it's arbitrary, because we try and craft it ourselves, and it's not satisfying. It's even at the start, it's already unsatisfying, because we know it's not connected to a larger framework, which is really what we want. I mean, even just from an evolutionary perspective, Peterson would make the point, we grew up in these small groups, these tribes. We need our story to at least have an impact on our tribe, on our family. If it doesn't make them demonstrably better, then it certainly doesn't have this. So this idea, this myth, this modern myth of the individual, it's ultimately very self-destructive.
Well, the thing I found a little bit strange about his, because I didn't see the end. I only got as far as when he was talking about Joseph Campbell recommends that you follow your bliss. And he said for him, that didn't work, because that really leads only to the idea that there must be some larger cosmic significance. Someone else is laying out this path of bliss for me to follow, and that this larger cosmic significance would mean that what he said was, if there is a God and he's laying out this path of cosmic significance for me, it doesn't tell me how to understand what he's asking me to do. So he rejects the follow your bliss thing, which I think is correct, because I always felt like this idea of following your bliss was a really poor excuse for life. Because suffering, hello. You know? But he rejects that. But then on the other hand, he says, write your own story. Well, how is that different from following your bliss? If you're writing your own story, then you're making up what's going to make you, what you think is going to make you happy.
Yeah.
And
it's
as we all know,
semantics.
our own ideas about what is going to make us happy are pretty pathetic when it comes down to it.
Yeah.
So here's I don't know if you ever read anything by von Hildebrand. I can't remember what his first name is, but I saw he apparently was quite a guy, and I saw his elderly wife on an interview with Eric Metaxas last week, and she's an amazing woman. She's like in her 90s, but still just full of wisdom. And but she was quoting something from her husband, and I thought this was a very interesting idea, that he said that happiness is the outcome of love, not the motivation for it.
And this gets back to what's the defining element of love.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say it's always self-sacrifice. Like you can't get away from that. Let me just read. I feel like it's connected. I left a comment on that video. I'm just going to read like the end of that comment. We are profoundly social creatures. Meaning on an individual scale is no meaning at all. We hunger deeply for community and for our personal story to be embedded in a larger story. That's why such a seemingly simple structure of the hero's journey is so stable across so many different cultures in such great lengths of time. Rather than being distinct from reality, the stories that survive on these timescales actually reflect reality in deep ways. This is a reality that is embedded deep into our biology, and it seems to be one of the most basic elements of what is special about the species human that has taken such a sharp deviation from our evolutionary ancestors. The hero's journey points us toward the very hard to hear truth that meaning is never to be found absent personal sacrifice, and that it is always the way in which our story makes its impact on the larger story, which I would submit is what we all really want in our own search for meaning. So I think that personal sacrifice, it's the hardest thing to hear, and we need we need the story to tell us over and over and over again that this is the way to find meaning, or we would never. We need that kind of push, or we would never do something that from the outset looks so foolhardy.
Well, when you were saying that, I just recollected a quote from G.K. Chesterton. Yeah, he said, all of the will worshippers, from Nietzsche to Mr. Davidson, are really quite empty of volition. They cannot will, they can hardly even wish. And if anyone wants proof of this, it can be found quite easily in this fact. They always talk of will as something that expands and breaks out, but it is quite the opposite. Every act of will is an act of self-limitation. To desire action is to desire limitation. In that sense, every act is an act of self-sacrifice. When you choose anything, you reject everything else. That objection, which men of this school used to make to the act of marriage, is really an objection to every act. Every act is an irrevocable selection exclusion. Just as when you marry one woman, you give up all others, so when you take one course of action, you give up all the other courses. If you become King of England, you give up the post of being a clerk in Brompton. I love that line. Even becoming King of England is limiting because you limit yourself to just that one thing and not all other things, you know. We see this with Harry and Meghan, right? They didn't really want to be royal because that kept them from all the other things that they might want to be. So if you go to Rome, you sacrifice a rich, suggestive life in Wimbledon. But so in a sense, every choice that we make is a kind of self-sacrifice, because you can't become something else if you don't limit yourself to something.
Mm-hmm.
You know, exercise is a sacrifice because you're going to work hard today so that you have something better tomorrow, right? And love is just the magnification of that, to take it, it takes it as far as the limit will go, right? That is the far extreme, is love. And maybe nihilism is the extreme at the other end, because nihilism says, you know, I won't sacrifice anything for anybody because it's all meaningless.
Yeah. I won't sacrifice anything for anybody, including myself. I mean, it's like nihilism is an attempt to escape, you know, being fooled by you know, the false meaning, right? It's that's the only thing that the only kind of I guess sop that it gives you for you know, you lose all your meaning, but you at least get to feel a little bit smarter than everybody else. Yeah, all the other suckers.
Well, so I've been thinking lately about this little corner of the universe that we are inhabiting. Do you ever start feeling as though the further and further you get into this world and the more you understand, and it's a very rich world to be in, a very tremendous place to be gaining all this understanding, but I sometimes feel that it's making me less and less there are times when it makes me less useful to other people in my own world, because I'm inhabiting a mental construct that they cannot inhabit.
Yeah,
They've not gone down any of the paths that I've gone down, and once you get a certain way down this path, it becomes very, very difficult to explain to anybody how you got here or what it is that's happening there. And so I've been trying to figure out a way. I think the only answer is to find a way to translate what we're learning here into a language that is accessible to people outside of this universe, to simplify it down to its essence so that it's useful outside of this corner. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally. No, and I totally understand what you're saying, because it's interesting, because you're right. There's like been this kind of sustained drilling into like a single area, like kind of drilling down into the middle of something. And then once you do all the effort to drill down, you do find yourself in this huge space. You know, I think again that Jordan Peterson kind of, in some sense, I don't think he created it, but he definitely created a map to get there. And once you're there, you're right. It's hard to say, okay, now how do I take what's here and bring it back? It's difficult to do. Um, and it is you bring up a good question too of what is the value of it. I do think there's something there that is really valuable, but it's like it can become kind of an end in itself, and it can be played. It can lead you into games that you're playing for the wrong reason, just because as a kind of a mental exercise of trying to put the jigsaw puzzle together, which I think can be in the end very unfruitful.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want it to evaporate into some kind of Gnosticism where we have some secret knowledge that other people don't have, because that's really not at all the way that I see it. But maybe for next time, there's a video that Jonathan Peugeot did just recently about monsters and the feminine. He did it with Andrea with bangs and sorting yourself out, those two YouTubers.
Okay.
So interesting because they ask questions that get him talking about things I've never heard him talk about before in terms of the way symbolism lays itself out. So one of the examples that he was using, Andrea was saying, well, because I'm the feminine, that means that I don't get a hero's journey. So what does that mean for me if I don't get a hero's journey, And so Jonathan was trying to explain to her, you have to understand, he used the phrase grasping your frame. We all need to grasp our own frame so that we understand what is the potential that each of us inhabits, because our potential, each of us are within a bounded potential, because there is only one unbounded potential, and that is God. So each of us inhabits a bounded potential, and that frame that we inhabit is based on our place, so to speak. So although the feminine and masculine show up in everybody, whether they're men or women, there also is a feminine aspect in me and a masculine aspect in you by virtue of the way we were born. So he said the feminine actually represents the one who focuses the attention, the one who builds the frame or sets the question. Basically, she sets the quest. She shows the knight where to go on his quest.
Right.
And so she's the one who is,
because in some sense he's going on the quest to win the woman.
Yes. So, but in a symbolic sense, that means that the feminine is the one that opens the space, points out where the potential is, okay? Maybe, and I've been really trying to think this through in my head, because I've been thinking about faith and hope. You know how faith is the substance of things hoped for. So, and then when you actually look at hope and what hope means, to me, I'm getting this picture that hope is what opens up the space and faith fills the space. So hope is like the potential and faith is the action that fills the space. So in that sense, hope could be like the feminine and faith could be like the masculine. And then love is what binds the two together, right? Faith, hope, and love. And of these three, the greatest of these three is love. So, and the only reason I'm thinking about that is it gives me a picture in my mind of this matrix, this Stephen Wolfram's theory of everything, the multi-way causal structure, right? that is a space, that's a place, a framework, or a a skeleton of a building, you know, that then needs to be fleshed out. And so the feminine is somehow showing the masculine where this space is, and then the masculine acts to fill that space, populate the space. And in the same way that the right and left hemisphere of the brain, the right hemisphere looks at this global potential that's out there and allows in that part of the potential that the right hemisphere is sort of framing something, bringing it in,
right.
handing it off to the left hemisphere, and then the left hemisphere takes that and builds a structure out of it, you know, creates something with it. So anyway, that's the way my brain works.
Oh, it's very interesting. Yeah, I think the feminine side of the equation is, again, it's you know, I've heard Jonathan say this before, that you can't talk about it too much, or you do something to it that is actually limits it in ways that aren't actually representing it anymore, right? Because some of what it is of the feminine is the mystery, it's the space, it's the question. It's, you know, it is, yeah, it's yeah, and that's very interesting, because this is the point, you know, Jordan's made, is that a large people don't realize how influential women have been on the course of evolution in primates specifically, but even more specifically in humans, because in humans, women are selective maters, whereas in like a lot of other primate species, they'll mate with whoever. So with women, they actually choose who they'll mate with, and you actually have, what is it, like double the number of female ancestors that you do male. And
I never could figure out the math on that. That does not make sense to me.
Well, because it's funny, because it's crazy to think how many people, like how much genetic material is in you as a person. You don't have to go back very far before you start getting into like the millions and millions. It's like, it goes back pretty, I mean, it's a doubling, right? Every generation you go back, and it goes rather slowly at first, 2, 4, 6, 8, but then it quickly gets very big, very fast. And what that means is that we're all related to each other in deeper ways than we would imagine. Mm-hmm. But it also, like in this particular case, it means like these decisions that were made by primarily females in the past about who they decided to be with versus not, had these very decisive effects on where we've gone over the course of that time. And Jordan he even plays this out in the Genesis story, where it's like it's the woman who plays the role in causing man to come out of his kind of innocence and have to see himself for the first time. And it's I don't know. He does all this symbolic reading on top of it, but I think it's interesting because in the modern frame, there really is no place for the feminine. Like to have a feminine hero is to just take the male hero's journey and turn that person into a woman. And now you have this woman who's more masculine than the most masculine male, to the point that she can beat up all the males around her. And she's like, it's like just copy paste, and I think that's been it's obviously pretty disruptive to the structure of our society and people's identities, to feel like the only way to play the game is the male hierarchy. It actually reinforces that patriarchal structure, rather than say, no, actually there's this other alternative to it that isn't spoken of, that isn't laid out in the same structured way, and is much more mysterious and has this infinite potential to it that isn't articulated, but nevertheless is there.
Well, I wonder how this all fits in with, the new wave feminism idea right now that's very, very strong in society, is that women are forced to do all the emotional work in a relationship because men are raised to not be emotionally open with other people, and the only person that they ever get emotionally open with is their wife or their partner when they made up with somebody. And therefore the woman is the one who has to do all the emotional labor because he's just laying out all his emotional stuff on her and not on people outside the marriage, where a woman does her emotional work both inside and outside the marriage in relationship with other people. And I can see what they're talking about, but I also see it through a much different lens. But I wonder if you have anything that you could add to that as a man.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
Have you noticed
well,
that you, now that you're affianced, that you kind of look at that as the place where you offload your emotional side more so than you do with other people?
not really. I think it's easier for me to do the emotional work outside my relationship with my fiance. But I mean,
Would that
I
take place like in small groups in the church, or?
yeah, that, or yeah, and just friendships and um but
Is that,
we,
is that different now that you're a believer than it was before you were a believer?
I don't know. I mean, I know when I became a believer, I the importance of vulnerability became very much highlighted to me. But it's, I still don't think it's something I'm very effective at or do well. It's something I have a conscious indicator for in my head that it's of infinite importance in terms of the way my life is going to turn out and how well I do that consistently.
But that was something that became highlighted too because of your faith.
Yeah. Well,
Because
actually,
I was
it's
having
funny.
a conversation with my daughter, and I was saying, I know that in the world, I do see this picture of a lot of men who are very reliant on their wives for their emotional support and don't, to the exclusion of people outside their marriages. They don't really open up to anybody else about what they're feeling.
Hmm.
But I said, my experience within the church is that the church is in the church, in our small group, in our life group and so forth, men are very open about their vulnerabilities in the group,
Hmm.
not just with their wives. And so they have other places to go with their emotional existence,
Yeah.
and that there's something about that the church is supposed to represent. The church as the body of Christ represents the way that the world is supposed to look when it's functioning properly. And while we still have our problems and our weaknesses and so forth in the church, the larger body of Christ, it's still better than what happens in the world, because in the world, you don't have that place where you can be vulnerable and be open about things, right?
Yeah. It's certainly difficult. I think men have it pretty difficult in terms of like there are the modern male is supposed to be incredibly sensitive, but if you are too sensitive, I think you're kind of punished for it as well, in terms of uh not being looked on as masculine. Or I don't know, maybe that's just my own biases, but I do think it's I don't know. It's difficult to know what the, because you have this idea of toxic masculinity, and it's hard to find what is the male archetype that you should be following if you don't have faith. I mean, outside of like Christ, a Christ figure or something like that, it's hard to find like an admirable example of masculinity. Most of the people in our time of day, even if there's somebody like that's really kind of top of the heap in terms of the hierarchy, they're usually shown that they've done something bad or horrible in their dealings with women, or they've cheated on their wives, or there were some misconduct of some kind at some point, and it's like, I don't know, there isn't a good narrative, I think, for men to look at and be like, okay, this is what a life looks like, well lived.
Well, that's partly a function of our time in history, I think, because in times past there were imperfect but at least somewhat admirable people to look at. But when you were talking just a moment ago, the immediate phrase that popped into my mind was feet of clay. They're all shown to have feet of clay. And then immediately I realized, oh, wait a minute, that's the statue in Daniel, right? Where the king has a dream and Daniel interprets a dream for him. And the dream is this statue that has I think the head is gold and the body is
It's worse and
brass,
worse as
the
it goes
legs are
down.
iron,
Yeah.
and the feet are clay. And so when the rock comes rolling down the mountain, the rock strikes the feet of clay and just shatters them. So,
Yeah.
and the rock is Christ. And so that picture is the idols that we make in the world. I mean, the statue is the idols that we create in the world. And they all have feet of clay, whether they're men or women. Yeah. Well, would you be interested in talking about this whole? So the video on monsters and the feminine is not just about the feminine. A lot of it is about this whole idea of the monsters at the margin, and how we identify those parts of ourselves that are, our monster side, and what we do with that. And very interesting symbolically. We might be able to loop it into this whole picture of symbolism. We never did get to data compression. Yeah, so before we finish up today, we should do a little bit about why you see story linked so tightly with data compression.
Right. Well,
first of all, what is the role of data compression for those who are not technical?
Well, I mean, in computer science, I mean, the data compression is all about. There's two forms of it. There's lossless data compression, which basically means, okay, when in the compressed form, you can get back exactly the way it was uncompressed, right? So you can go back and forth between the two without any sort of loss of data whatsoever.
And you're compressing the data so that you can transfer it more effectively and more swiftly?
Right. Store it, transfer it. The same reasons we do data compression, right? But more often, any sort of analog that gets converted to digital, such as video, audio, et cetera, all that tends to be lossy. So like you're making some trade-offs for you're throwing away some data in an effort to get your size down to something that's more manageable. And so, and this is more what I think correlates with what we're doing with things like language and story. that they're highly very lossy, because and mainly one of the reasons they're so lossy is because the hardware and the software whereby this compression decompression is going back and forth, is different for everybody, right? And there's a huge cultural context that forms how that decompression compression structure happens, right? And one of the overriding kind of controls for how that takes place is the way these different stories are nestled inside each other, right? And so your largest story has the greatest power to kind of constrict and narrow and redefine the stories that are embedded in it, right? And to reinterpret them in different ways. And so if you have fundamentally different grand narratives that are controlling one individual versus another, how are they going to communicate something that is fairly high level and abstract, that needs all that decompression to make sense of what's being said, into something more concrete? There's all kinds of potential for loss of signal in that process. And so it's no wonder that different political parties, for instance, have a very hard time even communicating to each other, even when they want to. Most of the time they're not even wanting to, right? They're wanting to just pull off various rhetorical techniques to make their opponents seem kind of laughable. But yeah, I think of it, you can just think of it like kind of like those Russian dolls that nest inside each other. That's really what our stories are. And everything everything gets fitted from the top down, so that depending on what those structures are, you come up with very, very different results. And Barfield is getting at this somewhat as well with his ideas of the collective representations. So because all of our language is kind of evolved in a certain sense, right? Because if it's not practical, if it's not useful, a word falls out of use. So we do get kind of shared. We have to have some sort of shared overlap with our communal structures in terms of what a word means for it to be useful, and those help frame things in such a way so that there is some sort of enough of a common structure that the communication can occur. But yeah, it's
Well, and so this is where pattern recognition sort of comes into it, I think, because you had made the comment in the last video that story is the main unit of data compression because it's aligned with our biology in such a way that we interact with it effortlessly. Mm-hmm. Right? So I get to thinking about story as, it's like the frame. Story is a version of a frame that we inhabit. And because I always think of frame as being like a boundary of some sort, and that made me think about, well, what about the negative space? So the story, well, so thinking about Barfield, there's the thing itself, whatever the thing is. Then there is the space that the thing inhabits.
Right.
So if you took the thing out, if the thing was inhabiting that space in some sort of a hard form, you took the thing out, the space would still be there and it would be the shape of the thing. So you have the thing, you have the space it inhabits. And then there is the space around the thing. That in art terms, we call that the negative space. Because sometimes when you are trying to draw, if you're trying to take your left brain offline so that it doesn't interfere with your drawing capacity, because sometimes when you draw, your left brain inserts, oh, I know what a chair looks like, and you start drawing a chair, but it really is just some sort of a stick figure of a chair, because that's what your left brain is telling you, instead of the chair you're actually looking at. So when you look at the chair, if you draw the space around the chair instead of the chair itself, you're drawing the negative space, you get a better representation of the shape of the chair than if you try to draw the chair. So there's the negative space. Then between the thing itself and the negative space around it, there's the edge. The edge that defines the thing also defines the negative space. They share that edge. Okay. So potential lives in the negative space. So we know if the thing itself is growing, let's say the thing is a fertilized ovum, okay? The fertilized ovum starts to grow, it's growing out into the negative space. It's filling the negative space more and more. And so it's moving out into the area of potential more and more, taking up more and more of that space. So this is what keeps getting me back to this whole idea that hope creates a space. When we hope for something, this sounds very new agey, but in some sense, we're visualizing a potential. We're seeing in the chaos, the thing that is in the chaos that is actually the good thing that we want to capture out of the chaos. That's what hope is doing. Hope is seeing where the good rests in the chaos. Now, the secret, I think, is that because God is good, ultimately, probably everything that's out there in the chaos is good, but it's not all useful to us at any given moment. So at any given moment, hope is identifying that part of the potential that's good for this moment. And then faith has the responsibility to live into that space. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. Faith is somehow that. So one of the examples that Jonathan Pageau was using about the feminine and the masculine was when Mary, the mother of Jesus, is at the wedding in Cana. She says to Jesus, they don't have enough wine. So she has pointed out the quest. It's time to start your quest. She's shown him the space that needs to be taken care of. And then he says to the servants, well, she says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. And he says to them, fill the jars with water. So they do what he tells them. They're acting in faith. Somehow, I think there's something there that action of filling the vessel with water is acting in faith. And because they act in faith, Jesus is able to turn the water into wine. So hope identifies the potential, faith populate.
Yeah.
No,
that makes sense. And I think too that you pointed out that the hope is identified with the negative space, which you would tend to think of on the outside of the picture, right? But I think what's also important to know is that that negative space can be inside the frame too. It can be kind of hidden in some of the details, right? Like you
there's
can
negative
kind of
space all over inside the frame.
Exactly. You can zoom in or you can zoom out. It's like at all these different layers, right? And I think that that's a lot of what Peterson's work has done, is shown that if you kind of scrape beneath and keep scraping, you're going to find this potential beneath everything. And it's interesting too, because you were saying with faith made me think of what we were talking about earlier, where when you act, you sacrifice all other actions, right? So that's kind of that's where the rubber meets the road, right? And to act, you have to you have to believe that this action's better than others, right? That there's something good going to come out of this action as opposed to other ones.
Mhm.
And you do so as a finite creature, knowing that you don't really know what's going to happen in response, but you're now committed to whatever comes out of it, and accepting it as a consequence of that. And there is something there, of submitting to that process, right? Because it is it's outside of your control, right? It's um it's this interaction with this larger reality that you have some map of how it works, but on the other hand you don't, right? um and so you're you're and this is where love comes in too, because love is it's taking that spiritual side and it's concretizing it in some like actual, you know tangible instance, um to bring those two things together. um but that's interesting, because I'd never really thought of that as faith as kind of the concrete side, and hope is more kind of the visualization, the possibility, the potential, and love is the thing that brings them together.
Well, and if you think about, so when in that story with Mary and Jesus and the vessels of water, and I'm sure there's some symbolism behind all of those things. And I never thought about this before, but he turns the water into wine, and that's his first miracle. And his last miracle is that his body, his his blood is shed for us. I mean, that's the wine, right? I mean, the wine is the beginning, the wine is the end. Well, not the end, it's the new beginning, but you get the drift. So I guess that reminds me of a story that C.S. Lewis used to tell about miracles, that why do we wonder that God can turn water into wine when he's always in the business of turning water into wine, because the rain falls on the grapes and the grapes get harvested and they turn into wine. It's just the only difference in that moment when he turned water into wine was that it was a compressed,
Yeah.
very, very, very compressed time, right? And not at all lossy.
Yeah. Well, and of course, Jesus always says, I only do what I see my Father doing. And that's his mission, is to reveal the Father. So yeah, it would make sense that the miracles have some element of that in them.
Wow, my mind is exploding.
Like, for instance, when he heals the blind man in John, he takes like the clay and he spits on it. So it's like he takes the earth and something of his own essence and spirit, and reforms the guy's eyes, which is kind of very similar to the account of creation of man in Genesis, where it is this kind of spirit and earth come together to form man. um, and
Wow. So the spirit hovered upon the face of the deep, and then he said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
but then also specifically when it gets to humans, there's the book I'm reading right now. It's called Becoming Human, and it's kind of reflections on Christian anthropology, and it's John is uh, a big point of reference in the book, but and specifically the ways in which John parallels Genesis. And you know when God says, let us create a human, it's the only time in the book. Every other time he just says, let it be, and it happens. It's like a snap of the fingers. But only when it comes to the humans, it becomes this kind of project. And it's kind of this self-reflexive thing, like God's talking to himself, like the Trinity is having a conversation, or it's like, let us do this. And then there is that he takes the dust of the earth and then breathes the spirit into it, and that's what becomes Adam. And it's interesting. It makes the point too that within the Genesis account, specifically only humans are created male and female. Even though, presumably all the other animals also have this quality of male and female. It only mentions it specifically of humans. And he makes the point that in this book that he believes God's project is the creation of human, and it's this ongoing project that isn't completed until the work of the cross. That in some sense, when Jesus says it is finished on the cross, that's really what he's referring to, is this act of creation that that's kind of ongoing. And it's interesting too, because like there is this divine spark in us, in I don't know, just while you were talking about that hope and that possibility that you visualize, I think there's something very spiritual going on in that visualization of seeing something that is unseen, but actually believing in it enough that it actually affects the way you act, which is it's very interesting to think about that, because I think like even like in say conversations like these, the way the conversation flows or where we go or don't go, a lot of it is determined by that hope, both, on the person listening and the person talking. Like there's this hope for something, that is kind of amorphous, and you kind of have an imagistic version of it, and you want to bring it into some sort of concrete reality so that we can have some communion over it right now. And I don't know, again, I think I say this all the time, but I feel like God has to be the bridge there making that possible, because otherwise it just doesn't seem very likely that we would get very far in that process. And the fact that we have there seems to be some fruitfulness from this, whatever it is, seems to have to be as a result of his involvement.
For which I'm super thankful. I'm just going to read one more quote for you. Well, maybe it's getting too late. I know you've got work. Maybe we can do this next time. There's a quote from C.S. Lewis about the Parthenon and the optative. He uses such weird language in some of his writing. So maybe next time we get together, I'll send you the link for that Jonathan Pajot video.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I will rewatch the DC Schindler thing, because I think those two together would be very important. Because when you do start talking about symbolism, beauty and pattern recognition all just has such a important part in that. So,
and I think beauty is it's the thing that is most important that doesn't get talked about, because again, it's holistic in nature. It's bringing everything together, and because of that, it resists our modern tendency to reduce and to kind of tell the simplistic version of things. Beauty has something different going on, where it's the exact opposite. It's, to use Vervaeke language, it's the reciprocal opening up versus the narrowing down that we like to do in the modern frame, which is exceptionally powerful and useful to reduce down into like the very minute details of how, electrons work, which gives us electricity, and how atoms work. We can, build like bombs and so forth, the nuclear bomb and nuclear power plants, et cetera, and understand even the basic nature of the world in some sense. But it's like we've lost kind of the capability to get wider and to have language that encapsulates the whole, because I think ultimately you can't talk that way without sounding religious. And we don't like that today.
Yeah. Well, so if will is ever more and more self-limitation, right? There's some way in which I'm going to get tangled up here because I'm using the same words in different arenas, but self-sacrifice is in some way, in one way it's limiting my options, but in another way it's opening up more and more and more to the one, opening up more and more to God.
Right.
So making myself smaller so there's more room for him. So
Right.
it's that reciprocal opening, which is expanding the boundary, getting closer and closer to this unlimited boundary, right? So
Yeah. Well, the more I'm willing to self-sacrifice, the more my story can be integrated into that larger story in ways that are beautiful, which I think that's really what meaning is at the end of the day. It's some aesthetic judgment being made about how does this fit into the whole. And that's anytime, like, again, that's anytime you're doing data compression, and storytelling, there's meaning involved, because that's how you do it. There's no other way to do it.
mhm. Wow. Okay, let's do it. I will send you the link and we have a path for next time.
Sounds
This
good.
has been terrific, Michael. Thank you. I've
Yeah.
enjoyed it so much.
Me too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.